In this video, we're going to look at how to use the motion graph view on the timeline for maximum control of our keyframe animation. To practice, we're going to do a classic animation exercise, the bouncing ball. There's a number of ways we could do this, but in this case we'll do it just by animating layer position with the layer tools. First off, notice how I have this set up. There's the ground layer, and I have this layer with my main ball artwork on it, and then I have separate layers with the shading and highlight on it, and those shapes have a soft edge effect on them. So if I render with Command R, you can see how the ball is going to end up looking. Now the base ball layer has its origin point in the center, so eventually we can make it rotate and it will look correct. But then all of the ball layers are in this group, and the origin of the group is set at the base of the ball. This is so we can animate the ball squashing and stretching when it hits the ground. The group is also what we'll be animating the position of. Now I'm starting in Channels view for the first part of this. We want to make sure the default interpolation is set to Bezier. That will let us manipulate things in the motion graph later. I'm going to start by setting my initial keyframe for the start of the drop here on frame 1. I'm actually going to do separate dimensions to get separate X, Y, and Z channels. That's because for now I'm just going to be animating the ball up and down on the Y axis. I'm actually going to delete the keyframes on the X and Z channels, so we're only working with Y. Then I'll come out and set the keyframe where it touches the ground. If you just grab it and move it, you'll probably end up setting keyframes on the X channel as well, but if you hold Shift as you drag, it will only move it along the Y axis, and you'll only get a Y keyframe. Then I'm going to copy and paste the keyframes a couple of times and space them out. These are going to be our bounces, and since each bounce gets smaller and smaller, we want them to take slightly less time each bounce. This is the timing I'm using if you want to follow along exactly. Now you might think we now need to go back and set keyframes in between these for the top of each bounce. But technically, this is all the keyframes we actually need. We could do everything else from the motion graph. But for the sake of demonstration, let's set the height of the first bounce with a keyframe. It's easier to define an exact height this way, and it will be good reference when we create the other bounces. Now we're ready to switch over to motion graph view. Now in motion graph view, if you don't see keyframes or control handles on your channels, just double click the channel icon and they should activate. And just in case you didn't set your keyframes to Bezier yet, you can always click the channel icon to select them all and right click and swap to Bezier. Now these Bezier handles work just like those on the drawing tools. You pull them out and change their angle and length to define the curve of the path. The key for the bounce is at the bottom. We want to hold Alt, which lets us break the different halves of the Bezier handle, which lets us make a sharp corner. And at the top of the bounce, we want a smooth curve, which means the ball is slowing down at the peak as gravity gradually changes its direction and accelerates it down again. Having this control point at the top of the arc is kind of nice. It gives us more precise control. But we can do a pretty good job of approximating the same thing just with the bottom control points for the other arcs. We want them to gradually get smaller and smaller, and by the end, they're barely there at all. You might need to zoom in to make your arc small enough. So there, we've got a good basic bounce, but we can enhance it with some squash and stretch. We'll do that by animating the scale property. So let's click on the transform handles on the ball to set an initial keyframe. And you can see we get a new channel on the motion graph. You might need to adjust the scale or center point of your graph to be able to see it. Then we want to come down to the point where it touches the ground. Now this is where the ball is moving fastest, so this is where it should be the most stretched out. So I'll make it longer and thinner, trying to keep the overall volume of the ball the same. So the scale is actually 3 separate properties too, but we don't need to fully separate the channels. I'll just double click the channel icon to get the 3 graphs at once. Now I just want to make this curve like our other ones, getting fastest right before the ball makes contact. And actually, we don't really want the stretch to start until the ball starts picking up some speed from its fall. So here's a cool trick. On the first keyframe, we can hold Alt and drag to make a hold that lasts as long as we want. So now the stretch part of the animation doesn't start until this point. Now that's the stretch, and after contact we want it to squash. So we're actually going to need some extra frames while the ball is in contact with the ground. So I'm going to Alt drag the keyframe to make a hold for another 4 frames. Then move the rest of the keyframes 4 frames over so our timing doesn't change. Now I've got 3 extra frames here where I can add some squash and stretch. Then in the middle, first I'll reset the scaling. Then I'll make a squashed state for the ball. Still trying to maintain its volume. Then we want to go back to its stretch state as it leaves the bounce. So I'll copy and paste those keyframes. But I'll adjust the ball so it's not quite as stretched, because the ball will have lost a little speed from hitting the ground. And now with the graph, we need to make it heavily ease into and out of that squashed state. And there, we have a nice transition from stretched to squashed and back again. Then before the top of the next bounce, we want to reset the scale back to normal. And then extend that keyframe into a hold until we want to start stretching again. And then adjust the curve so there's heavy ease out. Then I just need to repeat that process for the next few contact points. I'm using the onion skinning and setting the markers to look back at the previous stretched and squashed states so that I can make it a little less extreme each time. Because the ball loses energy with each bounce, it's not going to be as fast or hit as hard. For this bounce, I'm just going to have 1 frame of the squash state. And then for these last few, I don't need the squash and stretch at all. So there, we've got a bounce with some squash and stretch. Now, what if we wanted to make this bounce across the screen rather than straight up and down? Well, that's easy since we have our dimensions separated. We can just go back to frame 1 and move the ball off the edge of the screen. And then at the end, move it where we want the bounce to stop. Now we have the X channel on our graph, and we can make that just gently slow out towards the end where it stops. I'm actually going to make the stopping point past the end of the last bounce because we're going to eventually have the ball roll to a stop at the very end. Now you might notice right away that we have an issue where the ball is moving even when it's in contact with the ground during the bounce. We'll actually take care of that at the end. The first thing I want to fix is the direction of the stretch isn't right anymore. It's straight up and down still. So let's use the shear tool to tilt the ball at the point it's stretched to be pointed in the direction of the arc. Then we need to adjust the easing graph the same way we've been doing so that it's steepest when it's coming into and out of the contact positions. Oops, need a keyframe on frame 1. And we want to hold on that first keyframe. Then we want to reset the skew at the top of the bounce and have it hold like we've been doing with scale. Okay, now let's deal with the horizontal movement during the bounce. I'm simply going to go to the contact point of the bounce and add a keyframe on the X channel. Now that's going to give us another handle and mess up our curve, so I'll just adjust that as I go to get it generally back where it was every time I set a keyframe. Then I'll just hold Alt and drag to make a hold that lasts for the duration of the bounce. And then I'll just do that for the rest of the bounces. So that's how that looks now. What I think we could really use at this point to make it look more natural is some rotation. So let's switch to the ball layer inside the group, and then we're going to want to turn on channel visibility for the group, though we don't need to see all of the properties. Then we'll use the Layer Transform tool to set an initial keyframe for rotation by clicking within this box around the edge. Then I'm going to go along and add some keyframes so the ball gradually rotates slightly as it bounces. Notice we're totally free to rotate without messing up any of the other animation, because this rotation is all happening inside the group. And as we get towards the smaller bounces, the ball actually rotates more and more as it transitions from bouncing to rolling. Then when it stops bouncing, we'll play with the end rotation so that it rolls to a stop. We need to make sure the easing out on the rotation matches the easing out of the X position. Then I think I want to make some adjustments to the bounce curve. The nice thing about the motion graph is you always know exactly what you're controlling, so you can make changes without messing up other properties. So now looking at it, I don't think the ball is rotating enough during this middle bounce here, so I'm going to rotate it a little more on the last keyframe. But then instead of going keyframe by keyframe and further rotating the rest that I've already set, I'll just select them on the motion graph and move them all further down so we get that same gradual increase in rotation. So there we go. Now I'll export that so we can see it with the effects on it. And then this is the final animation. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how the motion graph lets you combine simple animations on particular properties to build up to more complex animations. We did all of this with basic tools on properties that every layer has, But to do good character animation, we're going to want to design and rig characters with a mind towards how we want to use the timeline to animate them. So next we're going to start looking at features that let us do powerful things in a simple way, starting with bones in the next video. I'll see you there.